Hey y'all, I am going to record this week's lesson. This week has been a little different. I'm sure y'all all noticed. And I've got all my kids home with me, so I'm going to record this, but I'm sure that I'll get interrupted a couple times by at least one of them, if not all of them. So just bear with me. But we're going to talk about our percents module. We're actually finishing that up this week. Starting with the percent equation lesson. So that's where I'm going to start today, and we're just kind of work through those last 3 lessons in that module. So it's the percent equation, solving application problems, and simple interest. Okay, so we're starting with that percent equation. If we talk about the percent equation, it looks like this before I start that example problem. The percent equation is what we use to solve to find the part or the percent of a number. So if we want to solve it, our percent equation is part equals the percent, remember that needs to be written as a decimal, times the whole. So usually when we start working through these problems, that's the first thing we're going to do is identify those pieces, the part, the percent, and the whole, and then set them up in the percent equation and solve. So that's what we're going to do here. It says find 52% of 230. So I'm going to find the part, the percent, and the whole, and then just plug those into my percent equation and solve. So the first thing it gives us is 52%. So that's obviously the percent, so I'm going to write that here. But again, we always want to write our percentages as decimals when we're using the percent equation. So I'm going to do that, convert it to a decimal. So to do that, I can divide by 100, or I can move the decimal point 2 places to the left. Either way, it gives me 0.52. Okay, find 52% of 230. So that word of kind of gives us an easy way to see the whole. Of usually comes before the whole if we're talking about part and whole. Let me turn my notifications off here. Try to. That beeping is getting loud. Okay. So the 230 then would be our whole. And we want to find the part of 230 that represents 52%. Okay, so since we don't know that part yet, that's what we're finding, I'm going to call it X right now. So I'm going to set this equation up as my percent equation, part equals percent times whole, but use these values. So I don't know the part, so that's X equals the percent, which is 0.52, times the whole, which is 230. And then I could just simplify this because I can multiply 0.52 times 230. And when I do that, I get 119.6. So my answer would be 119.6 is 52% of 230. So let's do one more like that. This one says find 30% of 150. So part, percent, whole. So again, the first thing it tells us is 30%, so that's my percent. But I'm going to rewrite it as a decimal, so divide by 100 or move the decimal point. 0.30 or just 0.3 of 150 tells me that 150 is my whole, so I'm going to put that here. And again, I don't know the part, so I'm going to call that X. So now I can set this up in my percent equation. Part equals percent times whole. So X equals 0.3 times 150. And again, since I have 0.3 times 150 on one side of the equal sign, I can just multiply that to simplify. And that's going to give me X equals 45, which just says that 45 is 30% of 150. Okay. Now we're going to move to the application lesson, so solving application problems with percent. So this will be the same skills that we've already used, but they'll be word problems. Okay, so for example, this problem, 25 kids are in our math class. 80% of the students in the math class passed the exam. How many passed the exam? So we know we want to start again by identifying the part, percent, and the whole. So the first thing it says is we have 25 students in our math class. So we're talking about all the students in the math class. So this would be our whole, 25 students. 80% pass the test, so that's my percent. As a decimal though, again, I want to write that as 0.8. How many pass the test? So how many out of the 25 students? So that's my part, I don't know yet, X. So again, if we kind of compare this to the last problem, we have part X, percent, whole that are given. So it's the same, it's just a word problem instead. So we're going to set it up the same way. So X equals, because I don't know my part, the percent times the whole, 0.8 times 25. So again, I can just simplify and multiply 0.8 times 25, and that's going to give me 20. But since this is an application problem, I want to kind of revisit this answer and put it in terms of the question. So my question was, how many students passed the test? So my answer is 20 students passed the test. Okay. All right, let's do one more application problem, but one that's a little different than what we've looked at. Same skills, but it's going to be set up a little different. Okay, so this one says John earns $2,200 each month. He has a car payment of $264 each month. What percent of his income goes towards his car payment? Okay, so let's go ahead and start just like we have the others. Identify our part, percent, and our whole. Okay, the first thing it tells us is that he earns $2,200 each month. So that's all of the money he brings home every month. So that income would be our whole, the total amount of money he brings home. So $2,200 is our whole. His car payment is $264 each month. So out of his income, he has to pay that much each month for his car payment. Since this is a dollar amount and it's part of his income, that makes it our part, not our percent, right? So $264 is our part. And our question says, what percent of his income is this? So this time we need to solve to find the percent. So I'm going to call the percent X this time. But my percent equation is still the same. Part equals percent times whole. But this time it's going to be set up different because we know our part and we don't know our percent. So our part is 264 equals our percent, which we do not know, X, times our whole, which we know is 2,200. So this time we can't just multiply 2,200 times X and have our answer because X is an unknown value right now, or a variable. So this time we need to solve our equation for X using inverse operations. And remember, inverse operations, inverse is another word for opposite. So that means we need to undo what's being done to X so that we can get it by itself. So if we look at X, right now it's being multiplied by $2,200. So it's being multiplied by 2,200. So we need to undo that, and we need to do the opposite of multiply, which is divide. And whatever we do to one side of an equation, we have to do to the other in order to keep it balanced. So we're going to divide by what's attached to X. Well, what is attached to X? 2,200. So we're going to divide both sides by 2,200. This way, when we divide 2,200 by 2,200, it equals 1, so we have 1x left here. Okay, that's what our goal was, to get x by itself. So those canceled out to give us x. 264 divided by 2,200 gives us 0.12. So we have x by itself, so this is our answer, but again, it's an application problem, so we want to go ahead and put it back in terms of the problem. So our question here, what percent of his income is his car payment? Well, it's 0.12, but is that really our percentage, or is that our percent written as a decimal? That's our percent written as a decimal, so we want to go ahead and rewrite this now as a percent. So 0.12 as a percent, we can multiply by 100, or we can move the decimal point 2 places to the right. But either way, we would get 12%. So his car payment is 12% of his income, is what that's telling us. All right, so those are a couple application problems. Now we're going to look at some simple interest. This is the last lesson in the percents module. All right, so this talked about kind of just some general information about simple interest. This is when we're talking about borrowing money. Okay, so we know that we have money that we're going to borrow and that they're going to charge us interest for the amount of time that we're borrowing it. So if we borrow $100, we're going to pay the $100 back, but we're also going to pay whatever interest is added to it. So the first thing we need to know in this lesson is, what is that amount of money that we're originally borrowing called? Okay, so that's called our principal. Okay, so the principal is the amount of money originally borrowed. So again, if we're borrowing $100, that's our principal. Any interest added to it is going to be some extra money that we have to pay back. All right, so we have a simple interest formula that we need to use for all of these problems. And it's just kind of like using our percent equation. As long as we use the formula, we can just plug stuff in and work it and solve, and we'll be done. So it's nice to have these formulas. So the simple interest formula says I equals PRT. Now remember, if they're sitting next to each other, these variables here, and they don't have an operation between them like a plus sign or a minus sign, it's an understood multiplication. So PRT really means P times R times T. Okay, now we need to identify what those pieces are. If you don't remember from the lesson, I is your interest amount, P is your principal, R is your rate at which your interest is being applied, and T, I don't need to go down that far, T is your time. So in years, that's important, time in years that you're borrowing. So this is our formula, I equals PRT. So let's do a problem and work it out using that formula. So let's say we want to find the interest. So find interest on a $6,000 loan at 5% interest for 1 year. Excuse my kids. All right, so this would be our problem. So we're going to set it up with our formula. I equals PRT. So it says find I, so we know that we don't know that yet. So I'm going to leave it as I. Our principal, or our amount borrowed, is here, 6,000, times the rate, which is 5%. But again, just like when we did with our percent equation, we want to rewrite that as a decimal. So divide that by 100. Be careful, 5% as a decimal is not 0.5. It is 0.05. 0.5 is 50%. So 5% is 0.05 as a decimal. Times our time in years. So it told us 1 year. So we just put a 1 here. And now we can solve. Since we're solving for I and everything else is on the other side of the equation, we can just multiply all that. 6,000 times 0.05 times 1. So that's what I'm going to do. And when I multiply all that together, I get 300. So I equals 300 is my answer. That's the interest amount. So really what I'm saying is we would pay $300 in interest if we borrowed $6,000 at a 5% interest rate for 1 year. So every year we would pay $300 interest. Okay. That's pretty much it. The questions after that are basically the same, just different numbers. The main thing to remember here is, well, two main things. Always write your percent as a decimal, and always use your time in years. Even if it gives you a time in months, so let's say that you're figuring out a problem but it only tells you that you're going to borrow for 6 months, you still want to write that in terms of years. So 6 months is how much of a year? Well, we have 12 months total, so we're just going to use part over whole to get our time in years. And then we could reduce this if we want, which would be 1/2. Okay, so if they give it to you in months, put that number over 12 to use for your time so that you can use it in terms of years and not months, because that will mess up your answer if you don't put it in terms of months or in terms of years. And I just messed it up when I said it. So make sure that you do that. Okay, that's all I have for today. If I went too fast, of course, this is a recording, so you can pause, rewind, whatever you need to do, go back to any problems that you want to see again. And then if you still have questions, just send me a message and we can work on it. All right, I will talk to y'all soon.